everyone. Today we're going to be talking about fossils, types of fossils, how they're made, how we find them, and what we can do with them. So today we're going to explain what a fossil is and the different ways that they can form. We'll describe how they're classified, and then we'll also talk about how they can contribute to the understanding of geologic time and adding numerical dates to our timeline, as well as our understanding of the evolution of life. So what's a fossil? It is the remnants or traces of ancient living organisms. So they're created by burying or by being buried by rock and preserved after that rock lithifies into, solidifies into a new rock. So paleontology is the study of fossils. So if you hear of paleontology specifically within geology, that is a geologist that studies fossils. So here's an example of a 200 million year old fossil skeleton in some sandstone with a penny for scale. And if you watched Friends, we have a very famous paleontologist here that was a star on the hit TV show Friends. He makes quite a few geology jokes in that show, which I hugely appreciate. So, quick quiz. Fossils. Which type of rock can fossils be found in? Igneous rock, sedimentary rock, metamorphic rock, combination of them, all of them, none of them. Think for a second. So if you are trying to do cross out the ones that are least likely, I hope you've thought, well, it can't be metamorphic rock because under high heat and pressure, whatever the organism was would be totally destroyed, and you are exactly right. So it's definitely not metamorphic rock. Oops, excuse me. Fossils are almost always exclusively found in sedimentary rock. There's very few fossils that can occur in due to ash falling from a volcanic eruption. So there can very rarely be organisms fossilized due to volcanic eruptions, but it would never be within solid igneous rock. The lava would destroy any organism within it. So it's pretty much always going to be sedimentary rock that you find your fossils. So let's think about how that happens. So here we have, way back in time, a dinosaur. He collapses on the beach from exhaustion and he dies. So he left some footprints leading up to him. He's right on the beach and he dies there. After a while, all that's left is his skeleton. This is, let's say it's a lake because there's no waves. It has not washed away his footprints. So the lake hasn't touched him, hasn't touched the footprints. They're still there. All that's left are his bones. So then there's a flood or an influx of water. The water level rises and he's covered in sediment. So both the dinosaur and its footprints are totally covered in sediment. So over time, more and more sediment accumulates on top of the dinosaur remains. So here's the surface now. We have no idea that there's a dinosaur underneath. Now, over time, we have this geologist driving, and there has been erosion on the side of this cliff where there used to be a lake. And it is to the point where you can see all of these strata that are younger than our dinosaur, to the point where he is actually discovering the dinosaur bones there that are trapped in this layer of sedimentary rock. So the way for this dinosaur to have been perfectly fossilized is it wasn't disturbed. It wasn't covered in washing water. The waves didn't wash the dinosaur bones away, for example. He just laid there and allowed for deposition of sediment on top of him to create a new layer of rock. It wasn't windy, nothing ruined the way that the dinosaur had laid and died. So that's why I said this cartoon must be a lake and not an ocean. The ocean would interact too much with the organism for it to have been so nicely fossilized. So there's a couple different types of fossils, and the types depend on the way that the organism is fossilized. So there's a couple different ways that fossilization can happen. That's how we separate different types of fossils. So I'm going to go through examples of each of these now. So the first is frozen or dried body fossils. So this is where something is completely frozen and perfectly preserved. For example, this is a baby mammoth that was found in Siberia and is 37,000 years old. So it was frozen in ice, and as that ice thawed many thousands of years later, the remains are uncovered. We can also have the body of an organism preserved in amber or in tar. So amber is tree sap that solidifies. It's often seen in jewelry. So if you see this really pretty yellow stone, that is actually amber. It's sap that has completely solidified. But it's very sticky, so many insects actually become trapped in amber, and then trapped in sap, and then when that sap solidifies into amber, we have a perfect insect stuck in there that we can study later on. So this bug is about 200 million years old, trapped in this amber. And if you've ever been up to LA, over near LACMA is the La Brea Tar Pits. If you haven't been, I highly suggest it. It's really cool. It is a huge pit of tar that is there naturally. And scientists have found many fossils within the tar that are perfectly preserved within that tar. So the tar almost looks like a lake. What would happen is a bird would swoop down, try to think it's a lake, try and take a break in the lake. It would get stuck in the tar. Something bigger like a coyote would see the bird struggling and then try and get the bird to eat. Something bigger that would eat the coyote would then come and try and get the struggling coyote. So it's a cycle of many things getting stuck in this tar. Eventually they sink, but within the tar, their bodies are perfectly preserved. So we have gained a huge amount of information about organisms in the past that have lived in Southern California due to this tar pit. What we call preserved hard parts, which are maybe the first thing you think of when you think of fossils. So this is where the hard part of an organism, which is generally the shell, is fossilized. So the rest of the invertebrate, whatever lived in the shell, is gone, but we have the remains of that shell because it was harder than, say, its little body. So that shell can get preserved in a sedimentary rock layer as that sediment deposits on top of the shells. We also have molds and casts. So this is often also associated with shells. So a mold is where we find an imprint of the shell in a sediment. So this is where we don't actually see the shell, but we see the imprint, we see the mark that it made. And then when this mold fills with another sediment, we call it a cast. So this is where this mold was actually then filled in with another sediment and created a rock that looks just like what this shell used to. So we're actually able to preserve the shape of that shell really well. We can have carbonized impressions of bodies, usually of leaves. So this is where flattened molds or casts can be created by really soft organisms. So they don't have to be shells. It can actually be really soft organisms. For example, this is some type of fern. And what happens is a really thin film of carbon is actually going to remain on the surface of the impression after the rest of the organic material of that leaf is actually gone. So after this leaf is gone, it's removed, there's going to still be that carbonized impression or that really thin layer of film exactly where the fern was laying. So this is a fern in shale rock. So it's not so much a mold, but it's actually a thin layer of carbon that was left behind as that fern was being decomposed and removed. And then the last type is what we call trace fossils. So trace fossils are formed by some kind of action done by an organism. So any mark that an organism can make that is then fossilized. So footprints, marks from feeding, burrowing, that would all be considered trace fossils. So fossil preservation, it requires unbelievably special circumstances to actually produce a fossil. So for the fossil to not be destroyed, for it to be around still at this time, it has to be really specific circumstances. So the main conditions that affect fossilization are going to be oxygen content of the depositional environment, so how fast do things decompose, as well as burial speed. So the faster something is buried, the less time it has to be moved to be consumed by something else. So if the burial speed is faster, you're more likely to nicely preserve that organism. And then also the presence of hard parts. So something that has nothing hard in it to survive is not ever going to be fossilized. So we do not have a record of organisms or of any organisms that have lacking hard parts on them, other than that carbonized impression that can happen with certain leaves and plants. So we have another principle for you. It's called the principle of faunal succession. What this means is fossils are always, for the most part, preserved in sedimentary rocks, and an index fossil can be used as a time marker. What we can do is study the fossil assemblage in each layer, or study the different fossils that are found in each layer. So you can find multiple fossils within a layer of sedimentary rock. So if we look at, in each layer, which fossils are found, we can use that as another puzzle piece for our dating of our rock layers. So for example, in one layer of rock, you might find all of these different fossils. This would be your fossil assemblage for that layer. Once a fossil species disappears in a strata sequence, it's not going to reappear. So extinction is forever. Once a species disappears, you're not going to see it again later in time. That's the basis of the theory of evolution. So we can use this fossil range, meaning the first and last appearance of those fossils, to help date our strata or date our different layers. So each fossil has a unique range of time in which it existed. So for example, the brown shell existed in layers 8, 9, 10. The little swirly shell only existed in layer 5. The oldest shell existed in layers 1 and 2. So the fossils can overlap, but they're never going to reappear. So after this one disappeared, he's extinct. He's not going to come back a million years later. So our index fossils are widespread globally, but limited in time. So what this means is it permits us to have global correlation. So if we see this fossil here, and then we see this fossil somewhere else on the other side of the continent, we can say that it must have existed at the same time as these layers. That other continent can then be correlated, or that other part of the continent can then be correlated to layers 3, 4, 5, or 6. It must have existed at some time at the same as layers 3, 4, 5, and 6, because that is where the fossil exists in this strata. So what we can do using our index fossils is determine a possible age range for each of our rock layers. So here is our rock unit A, and in A exists these 5 fossils. So what we can do is use the age range of our known trace fossils to figure out when these five fossils could have overlapped. So when could these have existed at the same time? That's when rock unit A must have been deposited. So you can find where in time we would have all 5 of these fossils. And then rock unit B has a different 5 fossils. So this guy and these 3 overlap, but the other 2 do not. So now we need to find where these 5 fossils overlap, because all of these 5 fossils were found in the same rock layer. That means they were deposited, this rock layer was deposited when all 5 of these fossils existed. So it must have been here, where you have all 5 of those fossils. So let's think about this example. So what's the likely age range of the rocks where both the fossil types are found? So here we have the poofy shell fossil. Here we have the clam mussel looking fossil. Here we have both. So if I say the clam mussel looking fossil has an age range of 25 to 15 million years ago, and the poofy shell is 19 to 12 million years ago, what's the age range of the middle layer where you're going to have both? What is the possible age range of this layer when we find both fossils? So you have to look at where they would overlap. So where these overlap would be between 15 million years and 19 million years. So it can't be 25 because this fossil is only found up to 19 million years. And it can't be 12 because this fossil is only found up to 15 million years ago. So here we would expect this layer to be between 19 and 15 million years old. So what we know about the earliest bit of life, condensed into one slide for this class, is life first appeared about 3.8 billion years ago. And life was just single-celled organisms in our oceans. Oxygen built up from bacteria. It built up in the atmosphere by about 2 billion years ago. And then around 700 million years ago, we had multicellular life beginning to evolve. Around 542 million years ago is the first time that we see hard shells. So these shells increased the fossil preservation, of course. So after the shells, we have a significant increase in our fossilization record. And about after that time, we have what we call the Cambrian explosion, which is where we had a huge increase in diversification on Earth. So we're going to do a whole lecture on this stuff later in the semester. So our fossil record is pretty incomplete. Why would that be? Because not everything can be fossilized. So not every organism is preserved. So there are many that were never fossilized that we'll never know about. Also, we haven't looked at every single rock. So maybe there's plenty more fossils that just haven't been found yet, or that are under the surface of the Earth right now. Also, fossils could have been eroded away. So if the fossil was brought to the surface and then eroded before any person found it to document it, we are not going to have record of that. And if there wasn't enough deposition on top of the fossil to preserve it, we, again, are not going to have record of that now. So what we do know from the fossil record is really incredible, but it is incredibly limited as well. Very, very incomplete. But it does give us a great way to add confidence to our numerical dating of our rock layers. So our oldest fossil, it's actually a microfossil because it's tiny. Our oldest microfossil was actually found to be 3.5 billion years old. So this was a really big finding, that there were microscopic fossils of living organisms about 3.5 billion years old, and it was in Western Australia. So this was a really big deal. It was only published in 2017, so it was only a couple of years ago that this microscopic fossil, the very oldest one that we've ever found, was discovered and written about. So when we talk about fossils, we have to think about evolution as well. So evolution is the change in a population over generations. So this is due to transfer of characteristics that can be inherited, and generally transfer of necessary characteristics. So some examples of that might be the neck of a giraffe. So the neck of a giraffe growing taller, growing longer, the beak of a bird. So depending on what the bird eats, it might need to have a really pointy beak. It might need to have a round, short beak. Or the color of a moth. So the color of a moth or a butterfly. Different things that help the species survive is called evolution. So as the species changes over many generations due to what helps the species survive, we call that the species is evolving. So natural selection is something that was named by Charles Darwin, and it states that the only organisms that are capable of survival will survive to pass on the characteristics to the next generation. So the most fit organisms are the ones that are going to survive. So the traits that those most fit organisms had are the ones that are going to continue down the line. So studying fossils in a sequence in time, we're able to actually observe the changes in a species through time. So we can see some of these progressive changes through time, through the generations. So the rate of evolution changes. So there can be gradualism, which is where evolution occurs really, really constantly and very, very slowly. So this is sort of the general assumption of evolution rate, the norm. Gradualism. It's very slow, it's constant. There can also be what we call punctuated equilibrium. So this is where evolution would occur in a huge jump. So where evolution is very, very slow for a long time, and then all of a sudden there's a huge acceleration. So these accelerations, it's caused by something new that's going to cause a huge change in the species. So a huge extinction, really, really rapid changes in climates, new environments, or an isolation of a population. So something that's going to change the way that population lives, the way that food web works, the way that population survives. If there's something that changes that, there's going to be what we call a punctuated equilibrium, where all of a sudden that species needs to change in order to survive. And then with evolution, there's also extinction. So extinction being when the last member of a species dies. This can also be considered when a species evolves into a new species. So that would be when extinction would be when the old species officially evolves into something new. There's some geologic factors, of course, that can cause extinction. That would be climate change, tectonic activity, volcanic eruptions with that tectonic activity, asteroids or comet impacts, and then also the appearance of a new predator or a new competitor. So climate change can cause new predators and competitors moving to find a better temperature. Let's say sea level change, sea level rise, either there's more land or there's less land. Different organisms are being forced either north or south to find a new home. They can encroach on someone else's territory, cause an extinction, mess up the whole food chain. So when the last member of a species dies, that is extinction. Remember in our strata, when we're talking about our fossils, when we see the last of that fossil, we do consider that to be an extinction. It's not going to come back millions of years later. So here's a graph here that shows diversity of life over time. So you'll notice that there have been some mass extinctions in the past where we see those dips in diversity. But over time, we have, in the more recent 200 million years, we've had a very steady increase in diversity of life. And we haven't had a huge extinction in many million years.